All right, welcome everyone. Right, I'm very happy to be here. I see we have a couple of hundred already on the Zoom and the YouTube links, and we are very thrilled that everyone has joined us here at 6 p.m. in Israel. I know a lot of people, international crowd watching here as well in the United States and in Europe, everywhere. So welcome and thank you for joining us. I hope everyone is safe. Before we get right into this, I just unfortunately this has become a regular drill here in our recent events. But if there is a siren, right, for those in Israel at least, so the drill is everyone goes to the safe place. You wait a few minutes and we come back, right? Don't disconnect or hang up. We'll just continue the broadcast, and then I'll come back and we'll continue our conversation where we left off, and hopefully we won't have to deal with this. All right. So let's get into it. We have a great panel of experts tonight, and I don't think anything has prepared us for what happened in the last month, and especially for the response in the United States. Just the demonstrations, the violence that unfortunately is escalating and escalating still, all over the United States. It really, demonstrates how powerful the impact of Israel's war with Hamas is in the United States and the American Jewish community, on the American left, and just everywhere really in the United States. And that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to try to understand a lot of these images that so many of us find so painful and so difficult to understand, I think, and to process. And that's what we'll try to do here tonight, with two of the kind of the leading experts and scholars and journalists in the field. So I want to briefly introduce them and just get into our conversation tonight. Professor Eric Alterman, right, is the CUNY Distinguished Professor of English and Journalism at Brooklyn College. He's the author of 11 books. He was also the longtime media columnist for The Nation magazine. And he's written extensively about media, about Jewish America, about the American left. And his latest book, which is warmly recommended, is We Are Not One, A History of America's Fight Over Israel. And that, of course, offers us much of the context to what's going on now.
That's his 12th book, by the way.
12th book. All right, congratulations. And I want to also introduce Jodi Rudoren. Jodi has been editor-in-chief of The Forward, right, the leading Jewish American newspaper, since September 2019. She's a veteran reporter, editor, digital innovator who spent more than 2 decades at the New York Times, including nearly 4 years as its Jerusalem bureau chief. So, of course, she's also bringing a lot of a lot of her experience in Israel reporting this. So, first of all, just thank you both of you for joining us. I know how busy and hectic this time is for you, but it was really important, I think, for us, certainly here in Israel, to hear what you think on the other side of the Atlantic and from your own experiences. I think both of you are based around New York, the tri-state area. So you're kind of in ground zero of what's happening now. So I want to start off with a general question. And I'll just say for all the audiences at home, there's a Q&A option for those on the Zoom, right? That's where you can write all the questions, and then we'll kind of filter and we'll pick and we'll converge and kind of I'll ask some of these questions. And for others, you're also welcome to email us at US Center at TAUACIL, just our, the Center for U.S. Studies, our email, and I also have that, and I could, ask your questions as well. So we're looking forward to hearing from you. All right, but I want to start off with a general question that I think a lot of Israelis, certainly Israelis, but maybe also a lot of people in the United States are thinking, and how do you explain? I think this question, I suppose for both of you, but maybe Jodi, maybe you'd like to begin. How do you explain the intense reaction that we've seen in the past month, the violence, right? Whether it's in Columbia, CUNY, Harvard, all over the U.S., and also kind of, were you surprised by the intensity of the reactions and by everything that's going on since October 7th?
Yeah, thank you for the introduction, and thanks for having me. The short answer is yes. I mean, I think it's been a month, right? The level of shock at the attack, at the scale and scope of the October 7th attack. In some ways, I feel like there's a little bit of a parallel here. So everybody who knows anything about Israel and Gaza and Hamas sort of understood a particular set of not so great cycles and tit for tats and the architecture of this conflict, and understood somewhat the roots of this conflict. And yet what happened on October 7th broke every paradigm that we thought we understood. It's not disconnected from those paradigms and understandings, but it was of a scale and a scope and a viciousness that nobody could have predicted, I think. And we know there was a significant intelligence failure in the Israeli system that allowed that made Israel vulnerable to that. And there's been some good stuff written about that, exploring that already, and there'll be much more in the years to come and months to come. I think I see a similar thing here with the campus thing, which is that we all have been writing and talking about a sort of crisis on campus around the Israel issue for many years. Before I went to Israel, when I was a national education correspondent at the New York Times, I did a piece I think it was in 2020, about the pro-Israel lobby training students to defend Israel on campus. This goes back a long way, and there's a couple of different aspects of it. There's the issue of how the debate over Israel and Palestine relates to the free speech protections on campuses. There's the academic discourse, the involvement in professors in either BDS, or there's the movements, the resolutions around BDS that we've covered. And there's a general generational divide among American Jews over Israel. And then there's also the ways in which the Israel issue plays into the broader left, and the whole question of Jews, Zionists not being welcome in lefty spaces on campuses and off campuses. We have been writing about that and thinking about that for years. And there was a clear intelligence failure, I think, for our understanding about exactly the intensity of all of those things. And I think the way it has played on campus has been pretty shocking to university leadership, to academics like Professor Alterman and others who live on campus and have been immersed in these discourse and these disconnects. But again, the virulence is pretty shocking. And it has certainly been shocking to parents, of college students, of aspiring college students, of applicants. I mean, 42,000 people have signed up for a new Facebook group called Mothers Against Campus Anti-Semitism that is rife with kind of anguish over what's happening to kids on campuses in the last number of years. We sent 11 reporters out last week to kind of embed on 11 campuses to try to get a fuller picture behind some of these headlines that we've been covering. And I think there was both this kind of familiarity with the general contours of these issues and a real shock at exactly how they've exploded on campus, and the idea of people really not feeling safe, not feeling isolated and not feeling safe.
So, all right, thanks, Jodi. So, I want to break down and explore some of the things. But Eric, do you have just an initial response to what has been happening? Kind of, you live right around Columbia. Have you been blown away by this? Have you been scared? If I may ask, have you felt scared?
First of all, I've not been scared. I don't feel threatened by Hamas. That's important, because it's important to me to make the distinction that this is not the Holocaust. This is not Stalin. This is not Turkmenia. This is a response to the treatment by Israel of Palestinians. To me, it's absolutely indefensible, morally speaking. I have a piece coming out in the New Republic about the campus battles, similar to Jodi's big package, although it's not similar, because it's just one piece. But I say in the beginning that I can't imagine ever having friendly relations with anyone who can't condemn this attack unequivocally. And I say that as someone who could hardly be more critical of not just Netanyahu, but the Israeli treatment of Palestinians since 1948. I try to say that, this country elected Donald Trump president and might do it again. Nothing really ought to surprise me.
Fair.
But it doesn't. Listen, I just to give some history, 2 points of history. One is that I went to college in 1978 at Cornell, one of the places where the crisis has really hit most deeply. And I was recruited by AIPAC then. AIPAC has been recruiting college students forever. And but back then there was nobody, there were no counter protests. It was AIPAC had the field all to itself. And so that's one fundamental change. Second thing is this, Jodi may or may not know, I was a columnist for the Forward for a while. But before that, I was on the search committee for a new Forward editor a long time ago. And one question that the search committee asked all the prospective editors-in-chief was, do you think Israel should talk to Hamas? And that was one way that they were judged on how the direction of the future of Israel. That was a question that was facing liberal Jews. Conservative Jews had, and I'm speaking politically, had no question that you shouldn't talk to terrorists, period. But liberal Jews said, well, you know, it's like quoting, I used to quote Abba Eban, who said, I would love to make peace with the Danes. I think he said the Danes, but we're at war with the Palestinians, and that's who we need to make peace with. And so I think you had to answer that question yes in order to get the job. And okay, that was a long time ago, but the fact is that everyone completely misunderstood Hamas, most particularly Benjamin Netanyahu, but everyone else too. And I think there's still a lot of that going on among young people, in universities and on the left. I saw an amazing poll, maybe people saw it. You know, it's hard to get more depressed about this than one was the day before. But I saw a poll yesterday that said 51% of young people supported Hamas's attack in the United States. And as you went up in age, the numbers went down to about 9% for people getting to be my age. So Israel has really destroyed its reputation among young people and on the left over the past 20 years, I would say, since the collapse of peace talks. Somewhat before that. I could go back to 1967 and talk about anti-imperialism versus imperialism, and maybe we should. It's just we're talking about the role of the left. So, but to the degree, the other part of my history I talk about is that even though I was a reasonably prominent critic among academics of Israeli policy, I was also the founder of an academic group, one of a few founders of an academic group that opposed BDS but supported BDS's right to speak on campus.
Right. So the free speech notion.
Yeah, and I was viciously attacked. I hate to use this phrase, by both sides. It was a very unloved group, and that kind of prepared me for the intensity of the anger that one gets if one is not perceived to be on one side. At Brooklyn College, again, I don't want to make this about, again, I could, and I will pick out deeply problematic behavior on both sides of this divide. But I went to a meeting Wednesday after the attack of Brooklyn College faculty and organized by our union to try and talk to, how are we going to talk to students about this? And the head of Judaic Studies said that just 2 days before, 3 days after October 7th, the Hillel had organized a prayer session for the dead and the hostages. And the pro-Palestinians, which I'm assuming is Students for Justice in Palestine, because it usually is on Brooklyn College, brought bullhorns to disrupt the prayer session. And that's one big problem you have on campus, that people don't allow people to speak. And because the Palestinian side is always outnumbered, they're always disrupting Israeli and Jewish events, and that sometimes can bleed into what looks like anti-Semitism. The much more powerful force is Jewish donors, are Jewish donors who are seeking to control the discourse and don't want pro-Palestinian professors to be driving the conversation that they're sending their children and grandchildren to college for. And that's been a big problem now for over 30 years. It exploded at Columbia University when Edward Said was there, and a professor named Joseph Mossad was coming up to tenure. Yeah, that's when Barry Weiss, as a college student, first came to prominence in this discourse. But what happened then, and I wrote about this in my book that you mentioned, is that students who had been grown up in a sort of pro-Israeli bubble, and I would again emphasize the fact that being pro-Israeli is the fundamental expression of Jewishness among most American Jews, were shocked to hear the truth about Israel in many respects in 1948 and 1967, and came home and told their parents, and their parents flipped out and tried to intervene via donors and via Jewish organizations like the ADL, and the whole thing became a political football that is now sort of on fire. It's a bad metaphor, but go ahead.
I mean, because one of the things that we've seen is to try to react among the Jewish community, and maybe we can now talk a bit about that through, everyone uses the resources that they have, and in this sense, I think there's been a huge, certainly, reorientation towards donors, towards alumni organizations. But to be fair, also we've seen in the last few weeks also, right, that you've had billions of dollars poured into a lot of these universities from Arab countries, Qatar, right, in Saudi Arabia, most kind of famously or infamously, certainly Georgetown, places like that. And so I want to talk about the money maybe, and also talk about the Jewish American reaction. And one of the most striking things, certainly for a lot of Israelis, and Eric, you mentioned this now, is the fact that probably just looking at polls, a majority of younger Jews, right, millennials, Gen Zs, certainly under 30, are more sympathetic towards the Palestinians than towards Israel. And that's something that older generations, even myself, I find that very difficult to comprehend. But maybe we could talk a bit about, and maybe Jodi, from your perspective, if from the forward, how do we explain this? The fact that so many Jewish Americans who, had they been born here, had they found themselves on the morning of October 7th around Gaza, they would have also been killed, regardless of their stellar left-wing credentials, right? Then the question is, how do they look at the world and justify, shutting down what was it, Grand Central and things like that?
I mean, I think there are obviously, like everything, this is complicated, and there's we're talking about thousands of people, and they have different individual experiences and perspectives. But I would identify maybe three main strains that lead us to this place where 51% of young people would say they support the Hamas attack. The first, I would say, is the youthful and particularly left sort of orientation towards and sort of looking for support of the way the leftist Jews have been in coalition with people who are looking to stand up for oppressed people generally, for people of color generally, and this sort of kind of anti-colonialist framing. So I think they see in the Palestinians an underdog, an oppressed group that and also just in general, like these are people who are very focused on and care about human rights generally, and they have found a way to see the Palestinian struggle and the Palestinian situation as part of the movement for Black lives and the support of the Uyghurs and the sort of a broader support for oppressed people. So I think that's one strain of this. I think the second strain has to do with alienation from Israel. And there are multiple factors in that. I would say the chief one is, the basic fact of kind of my generations, and Eric's probably a couple years older than me, orientation towards what is going on with Israel and the Palestinians was the idea that there was a temporary occupation that grew out of a defensive war and that was going to be resolved, first, hopefully through the, right after the 60s, everything, right after 67, everything from, Israel and the American Jewish community defined this as a temporary occupation. What were we going to do to, figure that out? And then, of course, that gets replaced by the Oslo process. But, when you hit the 50-year mark on a temporary occupation, you no longer see that, that does not seem temporary or any kind of, difficult situation Israel's finding itself in. What should it do with this land? It feels like there is this ongoing thing. And of course, we see the expansion of settlements and settler violence as part of that. And then on top of that, most recently, Netanyahu's right-wing government and the protest movement, et cetera. So I would say that combined with also the distance from the Holocaust, the reality of growing up Jewish, prosperous, and free in America, the notion of the need for Israel as a safe haven has diminished. The notion of Israel as a unreliable, what is it doing in the West Bank? It has made it people angry at Israel. So you've got first the framing of the Palestinian struggle as part of this broader set of struggles those people care about. Second, an alienation from an Israel that doesn't seem as necessary to them and seems to be, not a temporary occupier of the West Bank, but a permanent one. And then I think the third thing, which is, I want to just really emphasize this because this particular poll that particularly shows like literally support for Hamas's attack, which Eric has so smartly, framed as like what? Like who could, support this barbaric and brutal attack? I just want to say this is about people who are getting their information from propagandists on social media. I do not believe that 51% of our young people support a terrorist organization that carried out a brutal and barbaric attack that left 1,400 people dead and 240 kidnapped. I believe that they don't know that that's what happened in the attack, that they believe that Hamas is a movement of liberation, a resistance movement. It is those things as well, right? But I do not think those people are like, saying I support what happened on October 7th with a full and fair picture of what happened on October 7th. I think they are basing it largely on the propaganda they are seeing on Instagram and TikTok.
Right. So ignorance. Yeah. I mean,
it's not quite ignorance, right? It's like disinformation. It's victim of misinformation and disinformation.
I see. Eric, do you want to pick up on this, right? Because there's a historical dimension here.
That's just what I want to talk about.
Yeah. That has to be incorporated, right? That goes back decades, even before 48, right? Right. You just wrote a book about that, right? So how does that play into our understanding?
First of all, I just want to say I think Jodi did a great job of laying out the issues that she was paying attention to, and they're probably the most salient issues at the moment. To give you some context for the things she's talking about, the battle over Zionism initially, once American Jews stopped resisting it, which of course they did for many years, but once became a real question of whether or not there was going to be an Israel, a homeland for the Jews in Palestine after the Holocaust, that battle was on the left. I'm going back to the topic of this, alleged topic of this conversation. It's advertised, which is Israel and the left. That question was, who are the imperialists and who are the anti-imperialists? That's the left was anti-imperialist. That's what it meant to be a leftist in the 1940s. And the Zionists won that battle against what were called Arabs. They weren't called Palestinians in those days. The Arabs were seen as puppets of the British imperialism. And the Soviet Union supported the Zionists in part to get the British, in fact, entirely to get the British out of the Middle East. And the nation and the New Republic were 100%, New Republic was quite leftist at the time, 100% behind Israel. There was the right wingers were anti-Israel because they were afraid that Israel would become a communist beachhead, because so many Jews were communists and also they were coming from communist countries. Beginning around 1967, on the left, the new left, that flipped. The new left became associated, the Palestinians in their terrorist phase became associated with the anti-imperialist struggles of the Vietnamese, of the Angolans, of the Cubans, and of course groups like the Baader-Meinhof gang in Germany, the Brigati Rossi in Italy, and the hard left, the Black Panthers, SDS, much of the student left, much of the anti-war movement began to endorse their movement against Israel, which became seen as an army of the United States, as an arm of American imperialism, and later the word colonialism became the word that was used. Now, after 1967, American Jews were kind of in a bind because they had to choose. Over time, their liberalism and their Zionism appeared to conflict. when George McGovern ran for president in 1972, the most far left candidate ever nominated on the left, he said, "Come home, America, except for Israel." He said, "We're staying with Israel, but every place else, we're going to stop fighting all over the world." And neoconservatives said, "Don't believe this guy. Even if he means it, why make this exception for Israel?" And so over time, and also because of Israel's behavior and its transformation, which would take too long to explain, but I imagine most people watching are aware of it. As Israel became more of a theocratic country, more of a illiberal country, as peace receded as a possibility. Remember, Israel just had 5 elections in which peace was not even mentioned by any major party. Israel became a conservative cause, and American Jews forced a demand this time to choose between their liberalism. And remember, American Jews, if you want to call American Jews white, I could get arguments about this on campus, but if you want to call American Jews white, they are the only white group that has stuck with the Democrats wholeheartedly, 70-something%. So they've been forced to choose between their liberalism and their Zionism. And Zionism, it's become almost impossible to support quote unquote Zionism in its contemporary form under Bibi Netanyahu, also under Bennett, I would say, and remain liberal. So you had to either carve out this exception for Israel, and people on the left call this PEP, progressive except for Palestine. Yeah, or stick to your guns and say, I can't support this treatment. This is contrary to my principles. Now, there are two, I'll finish up here. There are two broad lefts operating. I'm not talking about the liberal left. We're not talking about Joe Biden, although if you had a right-winger on here, they would be accused Joe Biden of being a leftist. But I'm talking about the left that I lived in 25 years when I was a columnist in The Nation. There are two lefts that are represented by The Nation. One is the old-fashioned left, which was once the new left, but is now the old left. And that is anti-imperialist, anti-Western, and is always looking, you know, it sort of views things the same way it viewed Vietnam and the Iraq War and Central America, that we're probably the bad guys. And I actually think in a lot of those cases, we were. I was sympathetic to that left for much of my life. But more important to the poll that Jodi and I were talking about is the intersectional left. That's the left that appeals to young people now. Intersectionalism is a I don't know if you want to call it an ideology, but it's a notion originally credited to a very smart law professor, Kimberly Crenshaw, which basically ties together all the struggles of oppressed peoples. Black Lives Matter, LGBT people, trans people, and the Palestinians, among others. And it says if you can't support one without supporting the other. Like Linda Sarsour said, you can't be a feminist and support Zionists. Now, that's why I think, in one reason, Jodi's summary was so good. You don't need to know the details of the Hamas murdering 100-something people at a rave festival. Who could really support murdering people at a music festival as a political statement? I can't believe that. I can't understand that. That's inhumane. But if you're not looking at the details, and most people don't, people are really badly informed in this country, then you know which side you're on. Then you know what your identity is. One reason I wrote the book that I did is because it has become impossible, and I think Jodi can testify to this. It's become virtually impossible to talk about Israel in the United States unless you share exactly the same assumptions as the person you're talking to, because people don't listen to each other on this issue. They just get mad at each other because it's not a matter of policy. What's the best way to solve climate change? What's the best way to reduce inequality? It's a matter of one's fundamental identity.
Yeah, just to pick up on that, I mean, it's so important what Eric's talking about, because I feel and the contradictions within what you've said are so, like, they just jump out at me, and I just want to like underline them. The first, right, and a lot of people have been talking about this, so this intersectional left that sees these connections between the Palestinian struggle and, let's say, the struggle for queer and transgender rights, the people who are talking about it are completely like either unaware of or ignoring literally Hamas's persecution and killing of queer people in Gaza. And I think I would argue like these things are really complicated. And so it is perfectly reasonable for somebody to support the Palestinian struggle and transgender rights. And that person needs to grapple with the fact that Hamas may represent some of their belief systems about resistance to the Israeli occupation and the Palestinian struggle, and is persecuting queer people under its rule in Gaza. And they have to like wrestle with that. That's complicated and hard. And the idea of an intersectional left ideology that just says these things are all the same and they're all mixed together and it's all or nothing is ignoring the truth. Similarly, the idea of somebody saying you can't be a feminist and a Zionist is just, and we had these clashes with this group and over the Women's March in I forget what year when Linda Sarsour said that, and then the Zionist feminists came out and said like, here I am, I'm a feminist and I'm a Zionist, and here's how I define it, and here's how it reconciles for me. And I think there was a group created called Zioness that is literally like the expression of feminist Zionism, and it's like. She can say that all she wants, but the living reality is that there are people who define themselves as liberal Zionists and as feminists. And so I think, and I think you hit on it at the end perfectly, which is one of the reasons this conversation is so hard, this beat is so hard to cover, this conflict is so hard to understand, is because it's a clash of, not just a clash of narratives, but a clash of narratives that are embedded in people's identities. And that's not how the world works, right? Like, so we have, first of all, most of us have multiple identities, which is, of course, the idea of intersectionality is supposed to be that we can hold multiple identities together, and we may prioritize different ones of them at different moments. And you shouldn't see everything through the lens of identity. Identity is only part of the picture. There's also policy. There's also, realities. And of course, there's other people's identities. So I think that we are describing some of the dysfunction around in the conversation here, and I just think like the responsible thing for journalists, for academics, for organizational leaders, for thought leaders, is to push back against this kind of whitewashing or blurring of the complexity, and to say like, let's get into it.
So,
I want to.
wait,
Can I follow up on this?
Wait, Eric, just a few things, and because it's like also like tons of questions. So just I find it so interesting, right? Because at heart, one of the things that we are seeing is the culmination of a certain intellectual poverty on the left. It's certainly on the right as well. It's been for a long time, right? But certainly an intellectual poverty, the inability to think. To find the nuance, right? What Lionel Trilling called the negative capability, which I think is what Jodi referred to, right? And we see that in this new, and that I think it's also one of the big kind of differences between the new left that emerges in the late 60s and the old left, right? And also the New York intellectuals, of course, that are kind of, that established that type of thinking. There's a ton of questions that people are sending us. I just want to raise my last question, and then we'll get to the audience's questions. Right, Eric, you mentioned that you found it, I forgot the word you used, maybe unconscionable, that there are certain members of the American left, intellectuals, or if they want to call themselves that, right, who are finding it impossible to say that Hamas, did a terrible thing, and the terrorists, using the word, right, that they committed terrorist acts, and they're unable to say that. And you said, you mentioned something even on a personal level, right? You said that there's certain people that you aren't able to, and again, it reminds me all these personal animosities over, right? Kind of with fellow travelers over communism in the 40s and 50s in the United States. And I get the sense that that's returning. And I'm wondering, I'm not comparing you to Norman Podhoretz, of course.
God forbid, I'll leave right now.
Right. But the personal animosities even, that this thing kind of engenders. Can you speak to that?
Well, you're actually giving me the opening I was going to take anyway, so thank you. I'm a historian. I have a PhD in history, and I think of myself more as a historian than I do as a journalist, although the rest of the world doesn't. Most of my life, I've been very unpopular with American Jewish organizations. Most of my adult life, they used to complain to the Forward a lot, actually, when I was a columnist there. But there was a brief period where I was popular, and that was when I helped found this anti-BDS group. And they were inviting me to their fundraisers to speak against BDS. And my problem with BDS, and I've said this, I would support almost anything that I thought would end the occupation. But I thought BDS, A, was contradictory to the purpose of the university, which is free expression, but B, was counterproductive in terms of doing what it's supposed to do. But like I said, I'm a historian, and the people I admire probably most in the world, intellectually, are historians. So a few years ago, I went to the American Historical Association meeting about whether or not to pass a BDS resolution, because I wanted to hear the best cases that could be made for BDS. And there were two things that were amazing to me about this meeting. One was it was the only meeting, and there were hundreds of panels at this meeting. It was in New York. Everybody came. It was the only meeting where someone could say from the podium, one of the invited speakers, I don't have any expertise in this subject, but here's what I think. Like every other panel at the American Historical Association, you were there because you knew what you were talking about. But on Israel-Palestine, you didn't know it. You didn't need to know what you were talking about. And then there was a woman who is technically a colleague of mine, who's quite well known on the left, named Sarah Schulman, who's a professor, a CUNY professor. And they were taking questions, and she's very prominent in the pro-Palestinian movement and BDS movement. And I forget what the question was, but she said, everyone keeps saying to me, what about Hamas? I don't care about Hamas. That's not the issue. But of course, as Joe Biden is so fond of saying, don't compare me to the Almighty, compare me to the alternative. It's true that Hamas would be worse for an awful lot of people to live under than Israeli occupation. As far as I'm concerned, if the Palestinians choose to live under a worse regime than they're currently living under, that they have that right. They should have that right. They should be allowed to live under a democratic regime, just as Zionism was founded to be a democratic movement, which it certainly no longer is. And so it's as Jodi was saying, it's a complicated mess. But I have to say, it's depressing, and this is every bit as true on the much more powerful American Jewish side than on the rather obnoxious pro-Palestinian side when it comes to campus battles, anyway, and battles in the media. People don't really care about what actually is happening. When people discuss Israel and argue about Israel, they're just waiting for the person who's talking to finish. You can't convince someone with facts. Before Hamas attacked, there was demands that the University of Pennsylvania president resign because the University of Pennsylvania had allowed an outside group to hold a Palestinian literary festival on their camp. And what they objected to was a Vietnamese writer who had won the Pulitzer Prize because he supported BDS. They didn't like that Ta-Nehisi Coates was speaking. Really silly objections. They didn't like that Mark Lamont, what's his last name? The guy who was fired from CNN.
Yeah.
He's now a professor at CUNY. And he was sort of run out of Temple University. That he was speaking. They couldn't stand the idea that students would be exposed to ideas about Israel that contradicted the narrative that American Jews have been insisting is true.
I mean, this is what Yoav was talking about at the beginning, and this is the core failure. And by the way, it's an incredibly un-Jewish thing. This idea that we should only tell one side of the story, that we can't handle complexity, that we can't rigorously ask questions about the text. Like our tradition is based on the idea that there is minority opinions, that there are minority rights, that there is always like a little bit of, you know, that we remember the sadness when we celebrate. And the idea, and, you know, people, I often raise this when people talk about the, you know, allegedly biased mainstream media about Israel. It's like, do you think that about the New York Times or whatever's coverage of any other issue that you're not as caught up in? Like when you read the New York Times coverages of Syria, do you find that to be biased? Like, why would it be around this one issue that you have this incredibly strong? So people's inability and unwillingness to engage on this issue in the normal way that they engage on other things is a huge problem, but it's a problem largely of the Jewish world's creation.
So a lot of people here are, I'm going to just condense a few questions because it's a perfect segue about freedom of speech on campuses, right? Right, and Eric, kind of, you made the point, right, about kind of the fact that there shouldn't be anything wrong with allowing, you know, whatever, a pro-Palestinian literary festival to, you know, to take place on campus. And I think most people would agree with that. The problem, and here just listen, we have one of the comments is about Brandeis, right? Brandeis just announced that it's going to de-recognize its chapter of SJP, right? The Students for Justice in Palestine, kind of ban it from using university name and facilities and so forth. And then the question that is asked is really, is this kind of a step too far? Is that already kind of, you know, denying students' rights to freedom of speech and to conduct this pluralist, open atmosphere that academia prides itself on? Or are there, or where are the limits, right? Because when I saw a lot of the demonstrations on the Quad at Columbia, and my heart was kind of, having spent so many years there, my heart kind of broke because I saw what I think was a Hamas flag. And then the question is that not, right? Where is the boundary? And here I'm thinking ethically, not necessarily legally, because legally we know that, you know, I don't think it breaks any laws so far. Yeah.
Well, also Ron DeSantis has sought to shut it down in the entire state of Florida, the governor. So that's a separate issue, more problematic than Brandeis. Look, I have been personally harassed by the Students for Justice in Palestine. I really don't like them. And I've seen them mistreat Jewish students at my university. But I've actually been interested in trying to do something about this issue. I think universities exist for free expression. I think that anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism unless proven to be anti-Semitism, unless the word Jew is in there, not the word Israel, not the word Zionism. I mean, think of all the anti-Zionist Jews throughout history. I think that for Jonathan Greenblatt, head of the ADL, to say anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, full stop, and then to say the words free Palestine are ipso facto anti-Semitic, I think that's evidence of intellectual bankruptcy, and it's a power play on the part of the funders of the ADL. By the way, one of whom is seeking to withdraw his money from Penn because of the literary festival, Mark Rowan. And I think that free speech, free expression at the university needs to be protected at the cost of the feelings of a lot of Jewish and often, let's be fair, Arab students as well. There's a lot of Islamophobia going on at universities. I have a friend who I quote in this New Republic piece that I couldn't get my friend Mike Tomasky to publish in time for this, but it'll probably be out tomorrow, named Shahar Sadeh, who was until recently the academic person at the Jewish Council, JCRC, Jewish Council for whatever that stands for, in New York. And I was telling her about this problem, and she said, "You're absolutely right. We don't need safe spaces for our students. We need brave spaces. We need spaces where our students can be challenged, where they can, on Israel-Palestine, but on everything. That's what you go to a university for, to learn that you don't know everything. And that can be difficult. It's most difficult because, and this is something I talk about a lot in the book, that American Jews, secular American Jews, not the Orthodox, have sort of outsourced their identities to Israel, and to the memory of the Holocaust. They don't know anything about Judaism, they don't know anything about Jewish history or Jewish culture. They know that they should support Israel and attack Thomas Friedman when he says bad things about Israel. And that's how they assert their Jewish identity. That's why there's so many different Jewish groups trying to assert that the media are biased against Israel, when I would argue the opposite is true. Now, what do you do about that? Well, you just, I mean, a lot depends on the context. It's not true to say that no anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic. There is some, surely, and we have seen an explosion, particularly of violent right-wing anti-Semitism, that is tied to white Christian nationalism, that is also a threat to Muslims and to LGBT people and Black people and gay people. And those are the people who are getting physically attacked. It's from the right, it's not from the left. The left says nasty things, but by and large, the physical threat in this country is from the right.
No, but we've seen in the last few weeks that the physical threat is becoming more and more tangible.
But this is where we have to get to the, I mean, let me jump in for a second. I mean, I think, I totally agree with Eric that we need brave spaces and that the universities need to be protecting, and not just protecting, but really fostering speech and open debate. And, the proudest moments, of American Jewish history has been when we've stood up for that, including protecting the Nazis marching through Skokie is an important, proud moment in our American Jewish liberal tradition. So, and by the way, anti-Semitic speech and racist speech are protected speech. So the issue is to find the dividing line between speech and harassment and between speech and violence, and to create on university campuses spaces where speech is fostered and developed and barriers against harassment and violence. I want to remind you, as you're cheering maybe Brandeis's ban of this SJP chapter, that before the war and a year ago, we were covering, and there's a case pending before the Supreme Court about yeshiva universities banning of its queer student club. The students at Yeshiva University, the queer students, have a club that was that the university refuses to recognize. So I would like to live in these are private universities, and there may be a way, they also get public funding. So those are the issues that are at stake legally. But I want my kids to go to universities where the kids get to decide what the clubs are. The students get to decide what the clubs are. And the university administration makes sure that the clubs can operate as they wish without impinging on the safety and independence of everybody else. And I'm not saying that's easy to do. It's probably a lot harder to do in 2023 than it was some number of years ago, although it might have been pretty hard in 1970 also. I'm pretty glad I'm not in that role, but that's their job. That is their job. You want to be university president and provost and dean of student life at one of these elite college campuses, this is your job. Figure out how to let the speech flow and the hate and the harassment and violence is the barrier. It's funny, all the synagogues now and other places, they have the big rocks out and to block the cars from driving. So that I don't know what the intellectual rock is, but that's your job, university presidents, is to figure out how to create this rock that is going to create a space where students for Justice in Palestine and the queer students of Yeshiva University and everybody else can say whatever they want, and everybody who's not there is physically protected, including from harassment. And the line isn't,
Jodi, do we sanction when, and again, it's so, the lines are so blurred. When does free speech or even harassment, when does it count as,
I suppose the Supreme Court would say, I'll know it when I see it. But I'm not saying it's I can tell you right now for everything, but it's condoning Hamas. Kind of know.
I think the question, because the question of the last few weeks is condoning Hamas, waving a Hamas flag, saying we support Hamas, as I was, shocked to see faculty members.
Here's my point. My view is that there is a big difference between condoning or cheering Hamas and committing a terrorist attack. I don't think that saying that I don't think wearing the flag of a terrorist organization should be banned. No, I don't.
At Cornell, on October 28th and 29th, someone posted physical threats on a listserv to Jewish students saying they were going to kill, rape, dismember pig Jews.
And they were arrested.
And that's anti-Semitism, okay? It's a nice, clear case. On October 15th, also at Cornell, at a rally for the Palestinians, October 15th, so it's very close to the attack, a history professor said he was exhilarated and excited.
Yeah, that's terrible. I saw that. I nearly fainted. I almost got on a plane and went to Cornell.
Yeah, but that's okay.
I mean, he apologized later, but he clearly should be allowed both to say it and to apologize.
I condemn what he said. Okay, but universities need to protect that speech. That's what universities are for. We don't have to like it. We don't have to be comfortable with it. It can. I'm an alumnus of Cornell. I could cry to hear that kind of thing. If I'd have been there, he would have had a problem with me, but not physically. But I would have spoken up. But I mean, what Jodi's saying is absolutely true. But she left out a crucial point, which is that if university, particularly Ivy League university students, I actually rely on Jodi for this one quote she once used. It's very hard to talk about how Jews in the media, in the US media, because it sounds like an anti-Semitic trope if you talk about the Jewish role in the media. And Jodi, in a conversation with Ben Smith, once said that Jews were radically overrepresented in the US media. And so I used Jodi rather than myself saying it, so that because she has the credibility as the editor of Forward to say that. I would be called a self-hating Jew, but if I just said it myself. So Jews are also radically overrepresented in the Ivy League, for instance. One of the Jewish funders of the Ivy League of Penn was attacking Penn because their Jewish representation, according to Hillel, now is down to 16%. So it's only 8 times the national average of Jews in this country, down from when it was much higher. And this is a big concern. Jewish, I mean, it's true, maybe there's some Qatar money in a few places, but Jewish funders in the Ivy League are really important. And late in this past few weeks, even beginning with the Palestinian Festival, they've been pulling hundreds of millions of dollars from Harvard, from Columbia, from Penn, and from other places. And college presidents have to respond to that. The president of Penn and the president of Harvard, both women, their jobs are they may not last. And if they don't last, it'll be because of the anger of the Jewish funders and the amount of source they've been able to inspire. And I find that deeply troubling. And like I said, Palestinian hassling of Hillel and Jewish kids writing graffiti on Hillel buildings. I'm told yesterday there was anti-Semitic graffiti written on the Center for Jewish History in New York, which really upsets me. It's a wonderful institution. If you've got some money, maybe you want to give it to them. But the problem in terms of free speech primarily is this attempt on the part led by the ADL, but many Jewish organizations, to control discourse via money. It happens with public money with regard to CUNY. We're under threat from the state legislature and the city council. And it happens in very wealthy universities from donors. And I would like to see a concerted effort on the part of Jewish faculty and other Jewish institutions to push back on that, because they're not getting much pushback. People are saying, well, there's so much anti-Semitism and there's such a threat that we really have to do something. But A, it's inconsistent with the idea of universities, and B, I'm not sure there's so much anti-Semitism, because Yoav, you yourself are having trouble distinguishing between supporting Hamas and anti-Semitism. And I don't think that's fair. I think Hamas is terrible in every single way, but they don't have a problem with me on the Upper West Side. They have a problem with Jews in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. And
well, here I would disagree. That they would have a very big problem with you, because the problem is against Jews. It's not against Israel. And that's one of the things that.
Okay, we disagree on that.
Yeah, but that's just a thing for a lot. And here, this is just a wonderful question, because one of the biggest things that have come out in the last few weeks is how big the divide between the Israeli left and the American left is, right? And it's exactly on that point that Eric just raised. It's this idea of the fact, I think, that an organization like Hamas right, it's an existential threat, not just to Israel, it's an existential threat to Jews, and therefore that lends a lot of us, I'm not speaking for the
I
Israeli
want to
left,
just
but just
I want to
lend us
point
to
out though,
support certain policies that our colleagues, I think, in the United States would find difficult. Yeah, please.
I do want to say that one of the things that has happened post October 7th, and there was a lot of conversation about this maybe for the first week or 10 days, and it's faded, is a real crisis within the Jewish far left. The Jewish left that really was more focused, I would say, on the plight of the Palestinians than on any kind of pro-Israel thing. Many, many people who work and live on the Jewish left found themselves shocked to discover colleagues, some within the Jewish left, like within JVP, or within the left alliance that we described, the intersectional left alliance that we described earlier, who were not condemning the Hamas attack. And those Jewish leftists found themselves in a real crisis over what they saw as a new fault line within their movement. And I mean, I think to some extent, Eric is part of this, right? He finds himself clearly on the side of, what happened on October 7th is horrible. And, I can't live it. But there are people he and others we're aligned with, we're working with, those who are more activist than intellectual, who wouldn't say that. And one of the fault lines has become around, what do people think about from the river to the sea? Palestine should be free. We quoted somebody in our campus project. She's a head of the J Street U chapter at George Washington. And she said, I used to think this slogan meant a certain thing, and now it feels differently to me. And so I think there is splinter. I mean, there's probably always splintering in the left and the new left, and there was a real crisis and splintering that is going on, or people are finding themselves, on different sides of the divide over both what happened on October 7th and then therefore what to say and think about Hamas. I think, the whole left, Jewish or otherwise, is very, very concerned about the collateral damage to the bombing campaign in Gaza. But again, within that group of people, even some of those people who are calling for a ceasefire, there are real divides over this thing of how to regard October 7th. And I think that we'll see how that shakes out long term in terms of alliances and coalitions.
So let me just, we only have about 10 minutes. I want to just get two questions in because we're kind of being inundated here, which is a good thing. Obviously, this is a fruitful conversation. One is about the media, right? Both of you kind of are experts in this field, and one of the big questions is how is this being framed, right? In a sense of, is the media biased, right? Because certainly, and in Israel, the perception is very different here, right? There's a certain consensus here that obviously the New York Times and things that we'd consider center left in the United States are very biased in the reporting of what's happening here. The example of the hospital, right? That Hamas immediately said Israel bombed, and then within 24 hours it was revealed that it was Hamas or Jihad, I forget, that was responsible. So how do you see the coverage and the framing in the American media of what's going on in Israel right now?
I wrote one bestseller in my life called What Liberal Media? And the first paragraph of that book says, the word media is a plural noun. You don't say, is the media, you say, are the media. When you're talking about the media, you're talking about a million different things that don't cohere. So very often when American Jews, and I guess today Israeli Jews, talk about the media, what they mean is the New York Times, and maybe the Washington Post, and I suppose CNN. The elite media. I think that, look, there is a radical overrepresentation, as Jodi once said. I love this conversation that Jodi had with Ben Smith. It's one of my favorite data points, where Jodi said, and Jodi, I'm quoting you because it's public. You said to Ben, I want to make the forward the Jewish New York Times. And Ben Smith, former New York Times and former Forward alumnus, said, the New York Times is the Jewish New York Times. The New York Times sees things from the perspective of the urban elite as represented by American Jews. So the New York Times is representative of the way American Jews see the Middle East, by and large. There are exceptions. That was a terrible headline, but it did say Palestinians say in that headline. It didn't say that it was true. It said Palestinians say, and that's something new. For the longest time, Israel had basically a free ride in the mainstream media, and now there's two issues. One is that the mainstream media has moved quite a bit to be much more sympathetic to the Palestinians, in part because of what Israel has turned into, but also the New York Times is not nearly as important as it used to be. No mainstream media institution is. Social media is how most, certainly young people, but I think most people get their news one way or another. It's something that I have been fighting a losing battle against. The first thing I tell my students is what is the source of your information? That's the very first thing I want to learn, but it's not something that sinks in very much. And everybody, news is siloed now. Everybody gets their own media. You can if you're getting your news from the Jewish Insider, then every Palestinian is a terrorist. And if you're getting your news from JVP or whatever on the Palestinian side, Mondo Weiss, then all Jews are colonial. So and there's no middle. There's no middle. So what you people in Israel are seeing is the Jewish, the pro-Israel middle. Okay, it supports Israel. It likes Israel. It cares deeply about Israel, but it has a lot of problems with Israel. And right now, because of the trauma of this attack, which I fully understand it to some degree, even feel a minor degree compared to Israelis don't want to hear that. But the New York Times has basically retained its sympathy for Israel throughout this attack, throughout this period, and will do so into the foreseeable future. As far as
I think a lot of Israelis.
I'll try to be super distilled on this. I've talked for hours about this subject, but I'll try to be super distilled. One, the New York Times is not biased in its coverage about Israel. Generally speaking, has not been. The biases are mostly entirely in the eye of the beholder, the reader. You can check yourself. You can check what you think about the rest of the coverage. You can check your neighbor's biases. It will prove true. Number two, in this conflict, the Israeli, because of the extent of the Israeli loss on October 7th and since, frankly, the Israeli perspective has been, the Israeli trauma and perspective has been even more prominent in the report of the New York Times and other mainstream media. And there's been much more vigilance about things like attributing death tolls to the, sources and stuff like that. So I don't think it was biased before, but the idea that the Israeli trauma and victimhood and perspective is not being represented is just misreading the homepage. Just look at the homepage. It's all there. Thirdly, the explosion. I mean, the headline was, Joe Kahn wrote an editor's note, spent 20 minutes in the audio platform describing it, explaining the ways they messed up the hospital explosion headline. Yeah. That is good. They should explain their mistakes. People do make mistakes. And the impact of this has been radically overblown. The idea that the people who, hit the Arab street in outrage over the strike were doing so because of a New York Times headline versus the propaganda that they were seeing, the disinformation that they were seeing on their social media is very naive. The New York Times is very, very important, has a lot of readers, and the Arab Street is getting its information directly from people in Gaza.
Right. So it's interesting because I think looking at the coverage from Israel and even among the Israeli left wing, I'm not talking about, Netanyahu's fans. I use the word we, but we find that, very difficult. The hospital reporting was just one example, but and also the op-ed pages, I think. But I see your point. I want to just one final, just because we're running out of time, and one final question that we got, and I apologize for those that we've had over 70 questions. I haven't had time to ask most of them. And this is actually very timely because today, if you didn't notice, we're 1 year exactly from the 2024. What appears to be a Trump-Biden rematch, right? It's a year exactly from today. And one of the questions here, a few questions are about that, about how do you see the Jewish vote playing out in the wake of what's happening now, how Biden's responding, right, which from our perspective in Israel is magnificently, but it could also set the stage for Trump. So just one of the questions here is that given the tension that Eric mentioned between liberalism and Zionism, do you think that for a lot of Jews, conservatism or whatever it is Trump's representing, it's not conservatism, of course, might Trump, right, or Trumpism serve as the political alternative for American Jews who do not want to relinquish their commitment to Zionism and certainly regarding everything that's happened in the last few weeks, right? Just the feeling of being threatened and possibly Islamophobic, sentiments and reactions. But do you see this somehow moving the Jewish vote in a year?
I don't think there is a Jewish vote. Jews are 2% of the country. Approximately 4% of Jews say that they vote on Israel, and they're divided. And again, call me an anti-Semite. Jewish money matters, okay? Jewish funders. That's
important. Yeah.
AIPAC matters a great deal. AIPAC is very important in its role recently in attacking anyone who might be critical of Israel, which means attacking progressives and electing centrist and conservative Democrats. But first of all, it's a long way off. Second, I mean, Joe Biden would never have a better argument about the alternative rather than the Almighty. In this case, I mean, Donald Trump is going to be the savior of the Jews. One thing we haven't had a chance to talk about is that the pro-Israeli right has a lot of anti-Semitism in it.
In America, you mean?
In America, well, Bibi too. Bibi is reaching out to all these anti-Semitic governments because they're pro-Israel and anti-Muslim. And in America, same thing. So the Republicans have been, in the past two elections, have run a number of commercials that have anti-Semitic dog whistles. George Soros is the most famous Jew in America, as well as in a lot of other places in the world. When he was attacked, by the way, by the Hungarian government, the Israelis were cool with that. They said, we agree. So I don't see a big problem with the 70% or so of American Jews who voted for Biden and voted for Obama going Republican. But there are an awful lot of American conservative American Jews, particularly Jewish funders, in the model of now Miriam Adelson, formerly Sheldon Adelson, who are more concerned with Israel than they are with anything else, and more concerned with a certain vision of Israel, the Likud vision of Israel. And they fund AIPAC, they fund the ADL, they fund other organizations that are even to the right of those organizations, and they are very powerful. And they also have a lot of representation in conservative media, particularly Rupert Murdoch's media. There was an article in the New York Times, I don't know if it's true or not, because it was entirely anecdotal, saying Jews were being tied to Fox News now. And certainly the New York Post is, if you want to feel better about Israel and this war, you should read the New York Post, because they haven't done anything wrong, according to the New York Post. So there's going to be a lot of vicious battles. You can read about them in the forward, I'm sure, over the 2024 election. But the numbers in terms of the votes will be the same. They will support the Democrats, as they always do, because that's being relatively liberal in the United States is a fundamental Jewish value.
Yeah. Jodi, are you as I don't know if it means optimistic, but do you think this might shift anyway the way Jews vote?
So, I mean, the short answer is no. I mean, virtually no Jews vote about Israel ever. I know that's like shocking to Israelis, but that's just, American Jews are a lot of things when they go into the voting booth, and even and like it makes perfect sense to me that the way you vote for president of your own country is not mainly about Israel. It's mainly about other things. There's a small chance that, depending on how kind of long the heated part of this battle lasts, that might be a little bit different in 2024. I mean, I think certainly if the election were today, you might see a rise in the number of not just Jews, but other people voting, naming Israel as an issue. In addition to the anecdotal information about Jews moving to Fox News, there's also anecdotal stories about Orthodox Jews who supported Trump moving to Biden over this. So that could happen. There's also polling out yesterday that paints a very dim picture for Biden, particularly with younger voters and Black voters, and I think what Eric has aptly described as the intersectional left. And those folks, the Israel-Palestine issue did not come out necessarily in the poll as one of the reasons, but I think he may have a problem not with Jewish voters, but with the intersectional left over his support of Israel. But I kind of doubt it. I mean, I think that this will American presidential elections are decided almost exclusively on how Americans feel about the economy 3 weeks before the election. Mm-hmm. So I don't think that this will be a major factor.
All right. So
I just want to add something to what Jodi just said.
Final thoughts?
It's true that historically has been true about 3 weeks before the election. But lately, what's been more true, I think, is who they think their enemies are. And I think Jews understand that the far right are their enemies, not the liberal left. They may not like AOC, they may not like Rashida Tlaib, certainly, but they know that Donald Trump and MAGA are not good for the Jews. And that's clear, and right. Jews understand that.
So I think it's interesting, Eric, because I totally agree with you. And I think up until October 7th, or even maybe October 10th, that felt really clear. Yes, there's anti-Semitism on the left, but it is so much not as threatening as the anti-Semitism on the right. I do think there's, quite a lot of concern about what's happening on college campuses in particular. Yeah. And people are parents, kind of before they're anything else in a lot of ways. And I think that I think that the concern over leftist, what I'm seeing, I live in the People's Republic of Montclair, New Jersey. It's a very politically lefty place and it's a very comfortable place. And I think the middle class and upper middle class folks I'm surrounded by are feeling two things very strongly right now. I don't know how they're going to feel in 3 months. One is a little isolated themselves and afraid to find out what their non-Jewish neighbors might be thinking about the conflict, and very, very worried about what is happening on campus, either to their actual college kids or to their future college kids. By the way, one of the things they're worried about is how to talk to their own kids about this conflict, because they have such strong disagreements with them about it. And I think that has raised concern about anti-Semitism on the left, or just discomfort with what the left is sort of all about regarding Jews and Israel. And I don't know that will ever translate to the ballot box, but it feels like a pretty powerful force right now.
All right. So, one of the things, obviously, that we can't predict what's going to happen the next few weeks or months. Certainly, if there's an escalation in what's happening now, right? The extension of the
an escalation. You think it's going to escalate from here?
I fear it will. That's why I'm so concerned, because what if it does escalate? Then I think.
I thought you meant an escalation in Gaza. Sorry.
I mean both. An escalation in Israel, unfortunately, would translate into an escalation in the violence in the U.S. And that it might, for the first time, not the first time, but for let's say, for the first time in a very long period of time, people would actually feel threatened as being Jews, and that, at the end of the day, might just thinking just how political behavior usually responds, that might bring a certain shift. Certainly, if Donald Trump comes in with all of the with all of these combative kind of statements, and is promising to ban Muslims and to deport anyone who's supporting Hamas and all that stuff.
Yeah, but I mean, I just remember Donald Trump is also the one who told American Jews that they're not good Jews if they don't think exactly as he does about Israel.
Yeah, but I don't think they'll remember that, if they're feeling threatened. People have very short memory, especially when they fear for their safety. But
well, sure, except he's going to keep saying that because he believes it. He actually believes that, we should have dual loyalty or whatever.
All right. So again, just thank you so much to Jodi and to Eric for your time, and it was very stimulating conversation. This was recorded, and a lot of people are asking, will be on our YouTube channel and for the Center for U.S. Studies at Tau. And I'm sorry if I didn't get to your question. And again, thanks again for everyone.
Thanks for having us. Thanks for your questions.
And right, and stay safe, everyone, and have a great
too.
evening.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for having us. Bye-bye.